Hello, everyone. I'm a little under the weather at the time of this recording, so I apologize up front if my voice quality is a little poor or I break my cadence with an occasional cough. This week, I have the privilege to present on the life and work of Cesar Chavez, a Hispanic American from the Southwest who dedicated his life to social justice for the working poor, particularly farmers. Depending on where you grew up, some of you may have had the opportunity to learn about Chavez in elementary school. I grew up in upstate New York, virtually the exact opposite side of the continental U.S. from where Chavez spent most of his life. So his contributions to social justice never made it into my elementary curriculum. That being said, this presentation was my personal introduction to Cesar Chavez and an absolute blessing to learn about his inherent relationality and hopefulness in the face of the economic and racial issues of the 20th century. I'll begin with an overview of his family origins and childhood to help contextualize the environment in which Chavez was formed. Following that, I will briefly cover some of his most notable influences and how they contributed to his lifelong work of community organization. From there, I'll discuss at some length the establishment of Chavez's labor union and some of the more impactful moments it generated. As a fairly committed Roman Catholic, I'll also reflect on some of the Christian influences that shaped Chavez's work and witness, and then offer some conclusory thoughts on Chavez's overall contributions to society. As a brief point of clarification, my source material used an abundance of terms to refer to Cesar Chavez's Latin heritage, as well as the heritage of the majority of farm workers he helped unionize. Note that throughout the presentation, terms such as Mexican American, Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, and Latin American are to some degree interchangeable. They are used to recognize the Latin roots of the disenfranchised laborers that Chavez represented, as well as note some of the latent racism part and parcel of their experience. In any case, I hope you find Cesar Chavez and his efforts for justice to be as life-giving as I did. Cesario Estrada Chavez was born near Yuma, Arizona on March 31st, 1927, named after his paternal grandfather. His parents owned a couple of small businesses in the area, a grocery store, an auto repair shop, and a pool room. His grandparents owned and operated a 160-acre farm nearby on which Caesar's entire family lived. While they were not well off, Caesar's family lived comfortably during his early childhood. With the economic downturn in the 1930s, however, Caesar's family, like many others, began to struggle financially. Caesar's father, who had taken out a loan to pay for part of his property, soon was unable to afford the payments and was forced to sell his family businesses. Caesar and his siblings would spend the next few years assisting his grandparents on their farm. His grandmother, a devout Roman Catholic, was the greatest influence on Caesar's own Catholic faith during his early childhood. With the economic fallout of the Great Depression still lingering, however, Caesar's grandparents eventually lost their farm as well, not being able to afford the property taxes. At the age of 11, Caesar and his entire family packed up all their belongings into a single vehicle and moved to California in search for work, but ultimately could only find employment as agricultural day laborers. Being the only source of employment, the Chavez family became migrant workers, moving from place to place as the seasons changed to help the local farms harvest crops. The conditions of migrant workers were poor. Caesar and his family lived in a one-room shack with no bathroom or running water, and at times they slept in a tent on the ground or even in their car. His parents and grandparents worked approximately 15 hours a day for a 30-cent wage, which was about $5 in today's wages. Despite these challenges, Caesar's mother made certain her children remained in school. She was illiterate and wanted Caesar and his siblings to have the education she never had the chance to receive. School, however, was difficult for Caesar. Not only did he struggle academically, but in integrated settings, he often faced racism from his classmates on account of his Mexican heritage. To complicate his education further, his parents' work as migrant farmers forced Cesar to attend over 30 different schools throughout his primary education, some of them only for a couple of days. After completing the 8th grade, Cesar dropped out of school to support his family by joining them as migrant farm workers himself. That was the end of Cesar's formal education. Chavez joined the Navy in 1944 when he was 17 years old. Like many others, he felt a duty to serve his country and had a desire to get away from the harsh realities of farm work. Even so, Cesar did not enjoy his time in the military. While it did open him up to new experiences, Cesar still suffered from the racial discrimination he grew up with. He served 2 years before being discharged and moved back home to where his family currently lived in Delano, California, where he would get married and start a family. He returned to his life of migrant labor to support them. The remainder of Chavez's professional life would result in his leadership efforts to advocate for better working conditions and wages for the Chicano farm workers he lived and worked alongside of. There were a handful of notable influences in Chavez's life after he returned to migrant farm work, the most notable of which was the community organizer Fred Ross. Ross, a white man, ran the Community Service Organization, or CSO, a local civil rights group that advocated for Mexican-American farm workers to develop labor unions fighting unfair wages and conditions, as well as increasing their involvement in voting and politics. Ross approached Chavez on multiple occasions, asking to meet with him, who was a prominent community figure after over a decade of migrant work. Chavez, initially skeptical of Ross's intentions, changed his mind after listening to him talk about the CSO, and almost immediately after meeting with Ross began working for the CSO. Ross would become Chavez's mentor for his future of community organization. The second most noteworthy influence in Chavez's life was Father Donald McDonnell, who was the priest of a local Catholic church in the poor neighborhood in which Chavez lived. Like Ross, McDonnell had a heart for social justice and devoted much of his ministry to the work of community organization. McDonnell's greatest influence on Chavez was an encouragement to read. Because of McDonnell's influence, learning, which was a challenge for Cesar during his childhood, became a great joy for him as an adult. It was McDonnell who introduced him to the work of St. Francis of Assisi and Mahatma Gandhi, from which Chavez derived much of his emphasis on nonviolence and peaceful protest. In 1962, Chavez established a community organization of his own called the National Farm Workers Association, or NFWA. His goal was to follow in the footsteps of Ross and McDonnell by assisting Hispanic migrant farm workers in achieving better wages and working conditions, as well as greater voting rights and political influence. A similar organization, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, attempted to accomplish the same goals for the Filipino community, who suffered from the same injustices as the Hispanic communities Chavez organization represented. After the success of the Delano grape strike, which I'll discuss in greater detail in the following slide, the NFWA and AWOC would merge into one organization named the United Farm Workers Association, or UFW, to better coalesce the voices of migrant laborers into one union. Under Chavez's leadership, the UFW adopted a slogan to represent la causa, or the cause. Si se puede, or it can be done, was intended to offer a hope to migrant workers who were unconvinced change could be facilitated without violence. It was also an ironic juxtaposition to the Sal se puede's neighborhood many of the laborers, including Chavez himself, lived, meaning get out if you can. The most significant impact Chavez labor union had was the Delano grape strike of the 1960s, before the NFWA and AWOC merged to become the UFW. On September 8, 1965, 800 Filipino workers under the AWOC went on strike across 10 grape farms in Delano, California. They demanded a raise in hourly wages from $1.25 an hour to $1.40, as well as an increase to the piece rate, a flat pay per box of packaged grapes, from 10 cents to 25 cents per box. Larry Itliong, one of the leaders of the AWOC, approached Chavez about gaining the support of the NWFA for the strike. The less workers available for the farms to employ, the more effective this act of civil disobedience would become. Initially, Chavez did not feel confident about the timing of the strike. He did not feel that the NWFA had the resources to sustain it long term. Despite his concerns, members of the NWFA gathered at Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church, the same church that Father McDonald served at, to vote on whether the NWFA would support the AWOC's strike. To Chavez's surprise, the NWFA voted overwhelmingly in favor of striking alongside the AWOC. Within 3 days, the Chicano and Filipino farm workers were picketing the Delano grape farms in solidarity for better wages and conditions across the board. Despite the initial fervor of both unions, the strike would last for 5 years. It was a great risk for migrant farm workers who depended upon those inadequate wages to support their families. To help galvanize the striking community, Chavez and Itliong supplemented the strike with a boycott of grapes, as well as organized protests such as public fasting and marches. A deal was finally struck between the unions and farms to provide significant improvements to the living and working conditions of farm workers, as well as increases in pay. The success of the Delano grape strike, as well as the merging of these two unions into the UFW, would lead to a series of social reforms for farmers with the continued use of strikes, boycotts, and nonviolent protests. All of this was led publicly by Chavez, who would grow to become a public face of reform for Latin American communities during the civil rights movement. As already mentioned, Chavez clung to his Roman Catholic traditions throughout his civil rights leadership. He notes that the meetings and protests of the NWFA and later the UFW were steeped in prayer. Nonviolence was categorical to his mission for social reform. Many Chicanos were skeptical that reform could be accomplished without violence. Chavez, fueled by his Christian faith and the influences of Ross, MacDonald, and Gandhi, wanted to show his community and the nation at large that nonviolence was actually more effective at producing change than any violent tactics they could employ. His emphasis on nonviolent methods brought great support from the African American side of the civil rights movement. The photo provided is of civil rights leader Reverend Jesse Jackson praying over Chavez while publicly fasting in protest. Fasting was a crucial tool for Chavez, both personally and in his civil rights work. He would frequently go beyond 3 weeks on water alone, both out of protest for the conditions that migrant workers lived in and as an act of penance. Fasting was a personal decision for Chavez. He never forced or organized fasting as a protest tool for the labor union. Even so, because of his public voice for migrant workers, many people were inspired to pick up the torch and fasted in solidarity with migrant workers and Chavez in hope of economic and social reform. During the Delano grape strike, Chavez organized a 340-mile walk from Delano to Sacramento, the state capital, and ultimately the place of legal power where change could be made. 80 Mexican American and Filipino workers walked 15 miles a day for weeks, all the while spreading awareness to other farms and communities of the strike, boycott, and protest for labor reforms. Starting from Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Saucepuedes, iconography of the Virgin Mary was used on picket signs to reflect Christ's solidarity with the marginalized laborers. Chavez and many other migrant workers among them viewed this journey as a pilgrimage. The idea of walking a great distance to reach a goal, to demonstrate the extent of his belief, was a mirror to his own faith. Chavez saw his civil rights work as the mechanism for his salvation. Given the Catholic emphasis on penance and good works, in his own words, Chavez reflects, If I am going to save my soul, it's going to be through the struggle for social justice. To wrap up the presentation, I wanted to offer some of my own thoughts and reflection on the life and work of Cesar Chavez. To begin with, it's crucial to recognize that Chavez's relational approach to social justice. He was, by all accounts, a man surrounded by other people. All of the respect and influence that he generated from his community and the nation at large can be derived from his inherent relationality. In my opinion, any account of Chavez that does not recognize his deep embrace of other people falls short. I believe this point is further supported by Chavez's lack of formal education. Unlike Martin Luther King Jr., who received a doctorate from Boston University, Chavez would never even acquire a GED after dropping out of school after the 8th grade. Even so, I think an argument could be made that he had just as much of an impact on social justice for the Hispanic community as King did for the African American community. I think Chavez's inherent value of others in light of his formal education tempers the notion that our own social impact and holiness will grow in proportion to our knowledge. What value is a Master of Divinity if it does not lead me to a greater love for my neighbor? Second, the UFW is still in operation today and functions in much the same capacity as it did under Chavez's leadership over half a century ago. Today, it's one of the leading voices for the marginalized groups of pushing for immigration reform. In a similar vein, the overwhelming majority of source material on Cesar Chavez is written as juvenile nonfiction. I found dozens of biographical works on Chavez written to children of virtually any literate age. Everything I covered in this presentation has been adapted for elementary education. If you found Cesar Chavez to be a figure of interest, there are plenty of resources out there that you might be able to share with your children or children's ministries. That concludes my brief presentation on Cesar Chavez. I look forward to answering some of your questions about his contributions to social justice and how it relates to church and empire. Thank you.